This is the Whole Care Network. Helping you tell your story one podcast at a time. Content presented in the following podcast is for information purposes only. Views and opinions expressed in this podcast are solely those of the host and guest and may not represent the views and opinions of the Whole Care Network. Always consult with your physician for any medical advice, and always consult with your attorney for any legal advice. And thank you for listening to the Whole Care Network.
Welcome, everybody. Happy to have you here today. Today, I want to introduce you to Alyssa. I hope I didn't butcher her name. She's a holistic coach, which we're going to learn more about it in a little bit because she's awesome. You're going to love her. Welcome, Alyssa.
Hi, Isabel. Nice to be here. Thanks for having me.
Tell us a little bit more about what you do, who you work with, that sort of thing.
Great. Yes. So I'm an executive coach. While I focus on leadership and performance and, creating metrics to be able to hit your goals, I also did that for a long time just as a coaching client. And for me, there was a part of it missing, which was the values piece, because we can sometimes get really caught up in the leadership, the performance, the next stage, the next promotion, the next raise, and we can become out of alignment with our values. So when you say holistic coach, the reason I use that language is because I want people to understand that they feel good about what they're going after and it's in alignment with their values. And as you know, too, life stages change. So sometimes the thing that was really important to you when you were 32 is different than when you're 45. And so what needs to change, or what are we looking at over time to make sure that you're accomplishing goals that are suiting your life as it is now? And we're looking at mental health, emotional health, spiritual health, all of those pieces, so you're not ignoring any area that's important to you.
I love it because a lot of the work that I do is also like paying attention to everything we do. It's not just go, go, go mode. It's about balance. I'm a chemical engineer, so everything I learned during college, it was about balance. We often forget about that. We often forget that if you start putting a lot of pressure, if you start adding more things, something has to give because there's no balance.
That's right. And it can very easily and very quickly get out of whack. I know for me also, a few years back, I had a bit of a health crisis, and I just was flat out ignoring everything my body was telling me, because it didn't happen overnight. It happened over time, and I continued to ignore it. It was like, why am I tired all the time? Why am I so tired? But also I can't sleep. Like all these different things that weren't really working, but I guess accepted them as like, oh, well, everybody feels this way. But my body was basically yelling at me saying, hey, this is not working. We need to find a better way. But it took other people speaking into my life to, I guess, bring it to my attention. And now my goal is to help other people not get to the complete burnout crash stage that I was in. But I love that you use the word balance, because that's exactly right.
Yeah, I love that word as well. And I've used it in mathematical concepts. If you add one apple to this bag, then instead of having 4, you're going to have 5. So
Yes.
And if you keep adding apples into that plastic bag, it's going to break.
Yeah, break or overflow, one or the other, but neither are good.
Yeah, this is a very first grade example, but I love it.
It's a great metaphor.
I wanted to talk with you about grief. I talk a lot, and here in this podcast, we talk a lot about self-care and what to do, but what do you do with grief? From my own experience, grief can really shatter your world. So what do you do with it?
I think the first thing is acknowledging that it exists. And I would I propose that that's one of the hardest things to do because for multiple reasons. One, there are a lot of things that happen in life that are not death, but death is really the only thing that we associate with grief. You lost a job, you moved cities, and it can be positive and negative things that happen that result in grief because there is simply a loss of what was. For example, when I moved from LA to Austin, I grieved my time in LA. I loved living there and I was super excited to move to Austin. So we don't necessarily think of that as grief. So first of all, acknowledging it and understanding all the different things that play into it. I think number two is just because you're not thinking about it all the time doesn't mean it's been dealt with. For example, I lost my mom when I was in my mid-20s and I was still in school and life kept going and there were family obligations. But because it wasn't top of mind, I thought, oh, it's fine. But we just smush it down and eventually it finds a way out, whether it's physically or emotionally. So there's the acknowledgement that it exists and all the different ways that it exists. And then there's the willingness to actually address it with somebody who knows how to help you move through it and not having any shame around it or being scared of the emotions, because sometimes there's big emotions, oftentimes associated with grief, especially a death or a big loss. And that's okay, but let's get on the other side of it. Because if you had a physical malady, you wouldn't ignore it. You wouldn't be like, my arm's broken, but it's fine. You would set it and do the PT or whatever you needed to do to fix it. But the internal things that we don't see, a lot of times we ignore. So not doing that is a great step to start.
You just spoke to me so loudly because when I also lost my dad, well, not my mom, but I lost my dad in my 20s, and I didn't deal with the grief of losing him until probably I was in my 30s.
Similar story. It was years later.
I just never acknowledged it. It was actually, I moved from Canada to Mexico, and I was like, okay, my life is crumbling apart. Why?
Mhm.
Like, and it was funny because it all came after I had succeeded in so many ways. And all of a sudden my life was crumbling and I was like, why? Like I had like this train of success and now everything is falling apart. What's happening?
A similar story because I think we redirect our emotions, our focus on those areas. So on paper, everything looked great. I was getting promotions, raises, awesome. And then at night, I couldn't sleep, I couldn't function. So there's a trade-off. There's also a heaviness that you just carry that once you've gone through the process, you're like, oh, I like literally feel physically lighter. My mind is clearer, it's more calm. But we have to take the time to address the things. And also a lot of times people will self-medicate the things away as a coping mechanism. But again, just a band-aid to something that needs like a true addressing, a true surgery.
Obviously, you help with grief. So there is from grief to grief. Not all grief is the same. Grief, the ice cream that I just finished, and there's no more ice cream in the fridge.
Yes.
And now I have to go to the store.
Yes.
Probably I don't grieve about that, but you get my point.
Yeah.
And then there's grief that really changes.
Yes.
How do you guide people once they have acknowledged that they're dealing with grief, or even if they're not dealing with grief?
You know, because as a coach, we're more of a guide, right? And we don't necessarily do a ton of past work. It's really bringing up with the client, like, hey, it seems like there's some grief here or some things that have not been addressed in this relationship or in this incident that happened or whatever it is. So talking with them about, do they feel that's true? What are the things that I see? And then inviting them into some of the exercises and different things to walk through it. Some of it, gosh, it really depends. Like if you lose a parent and your other parent is not prepared for it, and then you're stepping in to care for them, that's one whole area because there's the grief of the loss that you can't really process. There's now the grief of seeing what's going on with your other parent or sibling or whatever's going on there. So, that's one bucket. There's also elements where you want to kind of celebrate the things of the moment of, okay, I'm moving. So let me talk about all the things that I really loved about this and be okay with having feelings of sadness that I'm leaving, even though I'm excited about the next phase. There is the loss of a parent that you didn't get along with? And am I dealing with guilt or shame around that? Because maybe I don't feel the way I quote should feel because I have lost that parent. So for example, for me, my mom, she had cancer. So when she passed, it wasn't like there was anything or anyone to blame. So I was telling myself, well, I can't have anger about this because I'm not angry at my mom. So it's also just acknowledging the different feelings that come because it's a spectrum, and we can't like put it in a specific bucket or put a specific time frame on it. So also giving people the freedom and the space to process it in whatever way sort of makes sense for them, and maybe you come back to it. Also, it doesn't have to be a one and done thing. So I think letting go of a lot of the rules too is another way that's really helpful for people.
I don't know if this is a question, but I've seen it a lot in social media right now. One of the posts that I saw recently was saying about letting go when your parent has dementia, like just accepting things how they are. I think this comes with a lot of grief, and it could be dementia or it can be anything else. If you're caring for somebody, there is a lot of grief involved. There's grief that they are changing, they're losing their health. There is grief that a dementia or Alzheimer's, you see your loved one become somebody else. And as you mentioned, we don't acknowledge this as grief. So now that we know that that's grief, where do we go from here?
I think conversations like the one we're having are very important because we're talking about it just in general so people can understand, oh, I'm not alone in how I'm feeling. Because I have found for myself, at least, adult of aging parents, that's its own sort of bucket. And I'll end up having conversations with friends or other people where I'm like, oh, you're also going through that. Oh, you're also going through that. So knowing you're not alone, there's also a permission in this conversation to say, I'm having these feelings. Speak them out loud. It is okay that you're having them. We don't have to keep them inside or go it alone. So I think conversations like this, just in and of themselves, are super important because there is that community that comes from knowing that this is something that at some point probably everyone is going through.
How do you find that community?
That is a good question. I have found mine, I would say, on accident. So, my three of my very best friends in the last like 5 years have lost their moms. So because I had been on that journey years ago, I could kind of walk with them. And so now we all talk about what it's like to have our adult aging fathers. And, we kind of share stories and talk. Or you and I, we met for a networking conversation, and all of a sudden all these different things came out. So I think there's just this communal element that comes from sharing our experiences and being open and vulnerable enough to talk about them and not just put it in our back pocket and hope for the best.
How do you gain the strength? I would say the balls. Because it's more than the strength. Like it is like a huge amount of energy that you need from going to like, I don't want to speak about this, to being open, to being okay, this is what's happening, and I want to share it with other people out there.
Gosh, I mean, so many elements to me that come up, which is dropping the shame around it, dropping the guilt around it, being okay having the conversation, having trusted people, because we don't just want to be vulnerable with everybody, right? You do it with the right people that have created a safe space for you, or the right environments or groups. Not being afraid of our emotions. I think a lot of people are afraid of their emotions, so they'd rather just ignore them or push them down or hide them or pretend they're not there. And so there is a moment of getting comfortable with them. And this is men and women, especially those of us who were brought up in maybe a more masculine career where we felt like we had to hide all the things about us that made us female and our emotions and all these things, because you got to suck it up and do your job kind of moment, and letting the pendulum swing back to a more normal place where we're okay talking about it, showing it in the right environments. And again, as I mentioned earlier, this idea that because I can't see it, it's because it's mental and emotional, it's fine. Because if it was external, most people will do something about it. But because it's internal, we just ignore it or set it aside. And if we can get in the habit of not doing that, listening to what our body is telling us, listening to what our emotions are saying, and actually letting them move through, it puts us into a healthier space where it's a little bit easier to share and talk about things. And a lot of us have also been taught that doing that is dangerous in some way because there's been backlash or somebody saying you're too emotional, you're too this, you're too that. So that's why finding the right spaces to do it is so important, because you can kind of test the waters and say, okay, I'm going to share a little. Okay, that was safe. And you can actually retrain yourself to know that there's safety in being able to share.
Baby steps, I love it. I was told several times by a boss, you're too sentimental. I've always thought, like, aren't you responding the same way as I am? Aren't you raising your voice? Aren't you getting frustrated? Aren't you all of these other things? I want to remark here because we are used to getting all these comments from male people. All of these comments wouldn't, like, if it was a conversation between two men, that conversation wouldn't even exist. I don't ever see a man telling another man, you're too sentimental. Like, that doesn't happen. And that's bad for men as well, because we all have our feelings. Either we like it or not, we have feelings. Those baby steps, I think, are very important to gain confidence in what you're doing and what is coming next. How do you start at finding, like, which baby steps fit correctly, like, for you? Because obviously we're all different. And
Yeah, you test it out. Some of my clients, for example, if we're working on something performance or job related, and then I'm seeing, hey, there's some sort of background stuff to work on. And to be clear, coaching is not therapy. So I'm like, tell me what happened with you and your mom when you were 7. Like, we don't do that. But for things like this, where it's like, hey, there's an underlying thing that if we can close that loop, we can help you move forward a little bit more easily and close off that kind of train of thought that's acting as an obstacle or a roadblock right now. But sometimes coaching can be helpful in this instance because there's anonymity and privacy, right? Like, you're talking to me as a coach who is not sharing anything we talk about with anyone, who isn't involved in your personal life. So sometimes people feel better being more emotional in that space where they know it's super private space and they can show and talk about things, but their friends not going to be like, bro, why are you so emotional? Right? If it's a guy, or a woman's not going to be told, like, you're too much, why you're crying all the time, or whatever it is, that can be a safe space for it. But you test it with the right people, and you don't go to 10 immediately. You go at like a 1 or a 2. Like you said, it's baby steps. It's, this person, I seem to be sharing some commonality. They seem to be open. They seem to be a great listener. I'm going to say this little part of this and see how it's received. And you play around with it and you practice, because like anything, that takes practice if you're not used to it, but that does allow us to get better and find the safe space. And because our bodies literally somatically want to tell us, like, that thing's not safe, if that's what our past experience is, we have to essentially train our brain using examples of, nope, that's not true, this is safe, or at least with this person it's safe, and you practice. So it's what we were talking about. It's those baby steps with safe people.
what else can you tell us about grief, how to go through it? I don't know, probably from your personal experience, how it's okay if you don't want to share it.
No, that's okay.
Talking about baby steps.
Yeah, no, a lot. So a lot of what I have said is a bit of my journey. So there were certain areas. So because my mom was sick, this was not a surprise to us. So there were certain things that we could address, I would say, beforehand, but there are certain things that can only be dealt with afterwards. For me, my dad had a really hard time. Obviously my parents were together for 30 plus years. And so it was difficult. So I had to kind of step into that space, and I was in school and working. So the emotions almost had to take a big back seat to just the functionality of still doing life. And at that age, I had zero skill set to deal with grief, and no one around me had any experience with it because we were in our 20s. Everybody still had their grandparents, let alone, losing a parent. So it was going at it alone. And I didn't at the time have the wherewithal to, like, think about therapy or find a group and, like, not do it alone. So I just kept on moving. And other things came on top of that, other things in life that were also creating grief. And so I started having some of the physical things when we're having constant headaches or backaches or things like that, our body is saying we're holding stuff in, and it starts to really, you have the physical manifestation of it. And then I was noticing my emotions were very tumultuous. Like I would get very upset at something that should be like a 2 on the scale of 1 to 10, but I would be at like an 8. Like, why am I so upset? It was almost like explosive emotion that was nothing to do with what was actually going on. So there was this fuel there that I was like, okay, that doesn't seem normal. And then also feeling just at the end of the day, when everything quieted down, I just felt sad all the time. It didn't have anything to do with my success or my friendships or anything like that. It was just this overarching sadness. A friend said, you should talk to my therapist. And I had been resistant to it because I think still back then I thought I should be able to figure it out myself. And so for me, therapy was a big part of just breaking that open and being able to talk to somebody in truth. And right before that, someone I was talking to said, well, why can't you be angry? And it was like huh, what? Like I felt like I was clutching my pearls. It didn't make any sense to me that I could have all these different emotions. So for me, it was really a journey, and other people coming beside me who could see things that I couldn't see to help me along the way, and showing me the safety in talk to that person, talk to this person, open up about it. And now I feel like I still have emotions around it because my mom and I had a wonderful relationship, but I don't have the feeling that when I'm talking about it, everything is just like living in my throat because it's so hard to talk about. It's debilitating.
What I admire from your journey is that you started paying attention to your feelings. When I started addressing my grief, it was my job. Everything started to crumble, but not emotionally. If I said I was in control of my emotions, I would be wrong, but I was sleeping perfectly. All of that was in control. It was just my outside world that was crumbling.
Mm-hmm.
And I went to a therapist and I was like, okay, I just want to go back to work and I just want to regain my life, sort of thing. And working with her and just like conversations, she was like, you're carrying grief. This is why your life is a mess.
It
Oh,
will find a way out. I'm telling you, Isabel, it will find a way out. So it could be emotional, it could be physical, it could be ways that your external world, because you're not able to fully address the things that you need to address. So it sounds like ours came out differently, but either way, it found a way.
yeah, it's like water. It's gonna get its way through.
Yes. Over, under, or through, it will find a way.
How do you start paying attention to those little signals that will let you know that you need help?
Gosh, well, I'm not the biggest fan of journaling. Let me rephrase. Journaling is one way. I'm not the most consistent person with journaling. That's what I want to say. Some people I know, every morning they're like, I journal for 30 minutes or whatever. But journaling is one way, just because you can kind of focus and get your thoughts out. For me, my faith has played a huge part in that, because when I think about scripturally, the fruits of the spirit, their peace, their joy, they're things that are not anxiety, things that are not, I can't sleep at night. So I was like, okay, I'm out of alignment with what the word says is the peaceful way to be living because of my faith. That was something else. I had other people pointing things out to me, saying, hey, something seems off here. So there were a lot of different things that came together for me that kind of brought it to a head.
I journal sometimes, and I used to be better at it when I was probably like 15.
Mm-hmm.
But I've never been huge on words.
Music, how do you feel? Are you bawling every time a sad song comes on because there are emotions that just need to go out? Also, I do think we underestimate silence, and our world is very noisy. But when you're taking a walk, when you're sitting quietly, if you even feel safe enough to do that, because you might be afraid to be alone with your own thoughts, what are you telling yourself? So that's another big way.
Something that happened to me actually yesterday, I was listening to a podcast and I was like, oh, I have these thoughts and
Mhm.
I haven't been aware of them. So maybe that's another way, like just listening to other people.
Absolutely. There's a book called Permission to Feel, and that's an interesting one too, because it helps name the different feelings. Because everything's not fine. We use fine for good, we use fine for bad, we just use fine. But there are hundreds of words in all these different sectors that like, are you joyful? Are things tumultuous? Like, what words are you using? Can you expand your vocabulary to think, how do I really feel? But there's an honesty you have to have with yourself in that moment that not everybody is comfortable with. Talk about not wanting to share with other people, but a lot of people don't even want to get that vulnerable and honest with themselves.
And sometimes you just open to the wrong person and that person doesn't know how to deal with your feelings.
That's right.
Not because they don't want to, just because they don't know how to.
Yeah, that's why you kind of vet your people.
That happened to me.
It's happened to all of us for sure.
I'm pretty sure it has, and I think that prevents us from opening to other people because, oh, this had like a terrible reaction. I don't want that
Yeah.
again.
It can. So there's a bravery in being willing to do it again with discernment, but being able to say, okay, you get into a car accident, which we don't wish on anybody, but it can happen. You do have to get back on the horse, right? You go and you do it again. So one incident doesn't define what that particular thing will be like always. It's simply that thing happened. So great. I'm not going to get vulnerable with that person in that way again. Doesn't mean we reject that person or anything. We just simply know there's certain levels to what they can handle and what I'm sharing. And we find either professionals or other friends who have a different type of capacity to hold space for us.
I agree. And I think the easiest is just to have someone in your corner helping you
Yes.
all the time.
Yes, exactly. And your therapist is paid to be there. So if you find somebody you jive with, do it. There's no weakness in getting help, asking for help, talking to someone, sharing with friends, whatever it is. So also getting rid of those negative connotations around getting help or healing for something that's affecting your life.
Yeah, of course. So if people want to work with you or know more about your work, where can they find you?
You can go right to my website. It's alyssajosha.com. So my name's right there. And it's got some information about me, how I work, a little bit about my background as a coach. And there's an option there to schedule what I call a coaching readiness call. It's just a 20-minute conversation to understand where you're at, what you're looking for, and also for myself and the person to get to know each other, because that's a big part of coaching is, do we have the relationship, the chemistry that we want to work together? And the thing that I like about that call too is if we don't seem like we're the best fit, I have a wide coaching network. So I'm always happy to refer someone and be like, oh, you know what, you're really working in this area. And I know somebody who's an expert in that. So it's a fun way just to talk and get to know people. You can also follow me on LinkedIn.
Thank you so, so much for your time. And for everybody out there, go ahead and connect with Alyssa. She's fabulous. She's like such a source of joy and information. And like, she's really holistic. I've worked with several coaches, and I can say that she really pays attention to all of the details. It's not just about how you perform in life. So thank you so much.
Thanks, Isabel. It was a pleasure.
This is the Whole Care Network. Helping you tell your story one podcast at a time.